Hello, it's Christmas and just past Hanukkah, and in recognition of that, episode 183 of the A is for Architecture podcast is a conversation with architect, photographer and writer Gili Merin about her extraordinary and exquisite book, Analogous Jerusalem, which came out with Humboldt Books earlier this year. In Analogous Jerusalem, Gili explores how the sacred topography of the Jerusalem of the pilgrim, particularly the Via Crucis, or Stations of the Cross, has been analogically recreated across Europe. Combining essays and a photographic travelogue, Gili argues that these analogous Jerusalems often surpass the original in their materialisation because, freed from the geopolitical conflicts and material constraints of the real city, they permit of a spiritual purity that connects the pilgrims more deeply to the Jerusalem of their imaginations, the Jerusalem that should be. We discuss a little of this and how Christianity displaced Jerusalem's holiness to distant landscapes, creating sites that foster devotion, introspection and community. Indeed, perhaps, through the words and the abundant beautiful images of shrines, routes and holy places, of the way Jerusalem's holiness has been reconfigured elsewhere, everywhere, the book itself is an invitation to readers to embark on their own virtual pilgrimage without leaving home. Jerusalem exists, I think it's reasonable to assert, in the public imagination in ways no other place on earth does. Its history is as a site of the sacred, as a thin place where the divine and the terrestrial, the cosmic and the territorial are not just revealed but viscerally encountered, as if the space of the city is more than space, more than city. As such, Jerusalem is an imaginary in the sociological sense, a set of values, symbols and ideas through which a people imagine their social identity. But in Jerusalem's case, uniquely, an imaginary a huge proportion of the earth's peoples feel connected to, gathering it into their own self and social definitions.
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the A is for Architecture podcast. I'm delighted today to be talking to Gili Merin. Gili, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. It's a real honour and privilege.
Thank you.
We're going to be talking about your very recent book, Analogous Jerusalem, which you published with Humboldt Books this year.
Mm-hmm.
It's an exquisite piece of work and as a piece of scholarship quite mysterious in a productive and generous way. I want to get to that in our conversation because I think it points to new forms of discourse which are really important. But before we get to all of that, would you be so kind as to tell us who you are?
Thank you for having me. I'm very happy to unpack some of the things around this book, which is really part photography, part scholarship, part pilgrimage guide, if you wish. So I was born in Jerusalem itself. For my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, I'm eighth generation in Jerusalem. Her family came from Aleppo before that. And yeah, I think that puts me in an interesting situation because for me, Jerusalem was always home or something very kind of disenchanting, I would say. And only when I began to travel abroad, I realized this place that Jerusalem has kind of ingrained very strongly in the geographic subconscious, I would say, of Western, sometimes even Eastern civilizations. Jerusalem really occupies this place. And I did study architecture in Jerusalem, a bit in Tokyo and Berlin in that process, a few internships in places like Chile and Rotterdam. But then only when I arrived at the AA in London for my master's in architecture history, I began to look at Jerusalem from an outsider perspective and to see the significance of the city to people all around the world and began to investigate this kind of very contested place. And essentially this place, because it means so much to so many people, it's been kind of at the center of battles to occupy it, colonize it, conquer it, and in a sense change the narrative of the place. And as architects, we look at how that happens in physical form, how the place, how the monuments, how the texture of the city is being gradually written and rewritten by different forces, often very violent forces. As an Israeli abroad in the last 2 years, but also, since forever, essentially the last 100 years. I think that it's important to always speak about whoever is ruling Jerusalem at this moment and to see what they do to rewrite the narrative of the place, to retell the story and to, in a way, authenticate their own custody of the city, their own patrimony over the city. Um, and this is something I've been working on more recently, let's say since I finished my PhD in 2022 and in my work and understand how the city itself is being shaped to confront the Palestinian existence and how that can be erased in a systematic way. And this is happening since 48, since before that, and even more so since 67, since Jerusalem was fully occupied by Jerusalem. But I also think that what's happening now in Jerusalem is just another version of what's been happening there since the dawn of time, or let's say since it was built 3,000 years ago, which is that in the city we have the genuine faith of people that are genuinely wishing to worship or to visit the sacred places. And then we have institutional forces that are trying to weaponize this faith for economic, political, and territorial gain. And of course, this is all the more happening in the last 2 years since October 7th. Uh, but in a way, with the book, I also want to show at the beginning of this violence, the beginning of these tendencies, and maybe somehow in an optimistic way, show not a solution, but the possibility of resisting this connection between land and blood, or between sanctity, sacred, and the political.
This podcast is resolutely and intentionally unpolitical, not
Hmm.
apolitical, but unpolitical,
Hmm.
because I'm not a particularly political person, and I try and keep the audience on side
Hmm.
because that's not its function, right? If you want politics, there's other things. But I did
Hmm.
feel like this book, and there's another book that I recorded a podcast with recently that's also coming out soon, directly after this one, in fact, on Gaza. I thought that this was a time to kind of look at this in a less ambivalent
Hmm.
way because it seems so stark.
Hmm.
How did it feel growing up there? Did it feel odd? Was it, I mean, obviously it's what you know. So as an Israeli, did it feel like an occupation? Did it feel, I'm not saying that it is an occupation, but did it feel in some way at odds with what one would assume a settlement would be like?
I think that there are many mechanisms in place to prevent that from being seen, especially by somebody growing up. Um, when you begin to gain consciousness of your spatial surrounding, let's say as a teenager, who starts to travel places on their own, and not with your parents. When I started going downtown Jerusalem alone by myself, I think there are a lot of mechanisms that kind of conceal this. So I think unless you come from a very critical background, it's very easy to not see it. It's very easy to live in your own ordinary life. As I said, growing up in Jerusalem didn't feel like a extraordinary city, like a place that was somehow special to the world because you're just unaware of it somehow.
Is there a trained unseeing?
Most likely. And I think there is a lot of narratives in place of victimhood that you are taught growing up. So I think it's only when I arrived at university at Bezalel in Jerusalem, which is sort of a quite political left-wing institution, art institution that has been around since the early 20th century, before the State of Israel. you have Palestinian students and Arab students and very definite faculty that is even has been signing different letters and petitions recently that the government wanted to kind of stop the funding of the school. Um, so I think only when arriving there for my undergrad, I began to develop this critical thinking. And then from then on, um, things changed. But I think it takes a very specific um, framework and educational kind of enclave to allow you to even start thinking in this direction. And then once you see it, it cannot be unseen, but
Mm.
it needs to start somewhere.
Do you think
Um,
architectural education and architectural ways of thinking, perhaps even designerly ways of thinking, are an effective tool for seeing things? I only ask this because, in design teaching, which I do quite a lot of, it's very hard to get learners, students, and clearly very hard to get practice to move beyond the kind of motifs of the site, the red line and the
Mhm.
windrows and the sun path and a little bit of texture. Did you feel like studying architecture was a particularly revealing way of understanding the world or that world? Now, it's a difficult question to ask because I'm basically saying, if you were not you, would you be you? Like, it's like slightly tautological, but
I think that to me, what helped me see more was photography. Maybe that's like an obvious thing to say because photography is a recording mechanism of the
mm,
visual sense. But I think that is what helped me become critical as well, to see more and to become critical.
hmm
Um, because photography forces you, at least forces me, um, to observe, to look for things, force you to stop. And that's why also I teach a lot with photography. I teach architecture through photography. My own PhD project was a photography project, my bachelor's as well, my master's. And today, when I teach at the TU Wien in Vienna, the Vienna University of Technology, I very much encourage students to use this as a tool
mm,
for seeing, for recording, and for thinking critically and spatially about things. And within this, I also have the history of photography, the, let's say, violent colonial history of photography embedded into this, because I talk about this in the book, but the beginning of photography also coincided with the constellation of forces that happened specifically around Jerusalem and the Middle East, which is the expansion of European imperialism, British, French, and others that were really at their height in the 1850s. I mean, photography began at the end of the 1830s, but let's say it was systematized 1840s, 50s, 60s. We also have the beginning of archaeology or biblical archaeology, which is the search for this authentication of the Western scripture, but to find it in the East in a way to justify why this is your land, in a way, from Napoleon at the beginning of the 19th century, end of the 18th century. And another thing which was interesting that happened during that time is the land reform of the Ottoman Empire. So 1858 was a big land reform which essentially allowed private property for the first time to happen in the empire. So European forces in something that was called the Soft Crusade could buy land in Jerusalem, in and around Jerusalem. So they could buy land and then slowly colonize the place. And then they could use it to dig up their own past. And this digging was not just, to find whatever they found. They wanted to find a very specific narrative. They wanted to find a very specific truth. They dug up the layers, sometimes calling them layers of filth. Some of these kind of archaeologist travelogues that I read, reading the layers they're interested in and removing everything else is kind of debris of centuries. And this process was, of course, documented with photography or enabled by photography or pushed through um, justified as this kind of desolate place that is in need of a Western salvation to arrive and save it. So I think what we see here is the use of photography as something that can justify violence, the very first act of coming to a place and representing it through your own visual, cultural frame, and then bringing it back to Europe. People would see what they want to see, which is a place that is in desperate need of colonization. In that sense, photography in the region is very similar to what it did in other places. For example, the Haussmannian project of Paris also used a systematic photographer to show why Paris needs to be destroyed and rebuilt for reasons of hygiene and cleanliness and, tight streets. So, in a way, photography was always used as this kind of tool to promote violent strategies. And it's also happening today. And I think within this context, I always try to understand my own photography and how it can resist that, or at least be aware of this past, the
Yeah.
past of this medium.
I suppose it's worth sort of describing the book itself at this point, which is that it's a thesis in its own right, and then it's interspersed with these very strong visual essays of photography, of your own photography, and
Hmm.
also archival and historical
Hmm.
imagery as well. So you spent time there documenting this thing. How do the two things work together? And in relation to what you were saying before, how does the mode of photography that you have utilized, where does it come from, I suppose, but how does it not fall into that trap of communicating a specific socio-political, I don't know what's the word I'm looking for. It's not idea so much as a kind of, yeah, thesis, I suppose, something, an argument.
Hmm. Maybe before I'll describe the format, I'll briefly explain what I was looking for, what I was photographing with this book, because we spoke about Jerusalem as this kind of very contested, loaded place.
Mm.
Um, Edward Said, in one of his latest texts in 99, wrote that Jerusalem is so overlain with metaphors and myths and stories that are attached to it that it completely conceals what Jerusalem really is.
Hmm.
It really obstructs the existential reality of the place.
Mm.
And I think here, I understand analogy as kind of a transfer of knowledge, maybe of an inexact knowledge, a transfer of a certain intelligibility from one singular to another singular. So, in a way, what I try to find is a way to understand Jerusalem outside Jerusalem, places that were translating Jerusalem away from it to give solutions for those people that can't or don't want or shouldn't visit the actual city, whatever the actual city is, whatever is left of it. I also write in the book that even Jerusalem is just an analogy of itself,
Mm.
because the city as such is really hidden behind this like palimpsest of representations and imaginations that it almost doesn't exist anymore. But I was looking for other Jerusalems. And not in a sense that you would just name a place Jerusalem, but that there's really an analogical relationship. So a spatial composition that is identical or similar, or in a way allows people or pilgrims, in my case, to enact the same movement they would in Jerusalem itself. So more about the physical movement, really the rituals that were enacted there, and see how this was replicated in other scenarios. Um, and then the places I was looking for,
And this, sorry, just to interrupt, but this is the Via Crucis mainly, isn't it, that you're talking
yes,
about? The way
yes,
of the cross.
this is the way of the cross. There was also other examples. For example, I there's also the most important church in Jerusalem. That's the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where Christ was crucified and then buried. And it's around these two nodes. Essentially, you have the basilica and the rotunda. One is a more linear space. One is a centrally planned space, and I mean, one is more for public rituals, one is more for private contemplation, and the combination of these two spaces together is what created this archetype that was then replicated in Cambridge, in the Round Church, in Bologna, in the Temple Church in London, and other places. And once you understand that it's not about material or scale or style, but it's about having these two spaces together, then you create this analogical architecture, analogical thinking about architecture. And you can replicate a certain combination of private and public rituals into other places. This is one example, but as you mentioned in the book, I mostly focus about the Stations of the Cross and how they create a certain rhythmic ritual that is based on movement and stoppages. So you have the stopping and the movement. And once you understand this code, the software, you can erect the hardware anywhere. And sort of, it can even be numbers with a cross to them. It can also be huge monumental churches and chapels. But this is the kind of foundation to what I was looking for. And then I was really looking for places that are, let's say, simple or non-monumental or sort of in people's backyards to find where something so grand as the Via Crucis, which for those who don't know, this is the way of Christ into his crucifixion, kind of grabbing the cross, falling down, getting up again, continuing, meeting a few people along the way, um, being crucified, entombed, and resurrected. So these are all stations in his journey that were also spatialized in the city of Jerusalem. And then in basically every Catholic church, you have these stations. So I was looking for places where this was enacted, usually in rural places. Um, and I think also the way that I use photography here was to often not monumentalize these places, but show them in kind of their ordinary surrounding. Also show the path of the place, the signs, the people, whatever makes this ordinary everyday landscape with the monuments in them, with the stations kind of embedded within everyday life. And to show how you have these two systems, you have the system of daily life, and then you also have the system of the pilgrim, which can almost be invisible to each other, these different systems, but they're not in contest with each other. Makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. So the stations, yeah, the 14 moments in the crucifixion
Mm-hmm.
and entombment narrative, aren't they?
Mm-hmm.
And as you say, they're transliterated into every Catholic church in the world in the form of the Stations of the Cross.
Mm-hmm.
It's quite a beautiful idea, the idea of the sacred space as an image of the heavens,
Mm-hmm.
Jerusalem and the New Jerusalem being heavenly.
Mm-hmm.
A very elegant idea. And your book, I think, approaches this not with the traditional, slightly antagonistic anthropologist's eye, but with a generosity. Did that spirit emerge through your engagement with these analogous Jerusalems? Or had you always seen these places in this kind of way? I guess I'm trying to understand what your motivation for this is. Like, what is the emotional content?
Hmm. I think that's what was interesting about looking at multiple places and this idea of the station um, is really a diffuse form of sacred space because it's not like you have the one place, but it's really a sequence of stations that break apart this one big element.
Mm.
And I think that going to different places in a way and driving and stopping and walking and stopping, I think being a photographer turned into kind of a pilgrimage with the photographs becoming an index of this ritual in a way. Because in the same way that a pilgrim would stop at every station to do a prayer, I would stop at every station to take a photograph.
Mm.
So I would somehow realize after a few years of doing this that I was also performing a sort of pilgrimage myself, only a secular one, I would say, stopping to take photos rather than to do prayers. And in that sense, there's a lineage of photographers who do these kind of journeys that I was reading about. And these are people like Stephen Shore and Walker Evans and Ed Ruscha. Um, and, Ed Ruscha even had his 26 gasoline stations, and his gas stations were his stations of the cross in a way. He had 26, which is twice the Via Crucis in a way without the final stop. At least that's what he says. Um, but I think even within this context, and this is something that you asked me before about the format of the book, it was very important not to stay only on photography because of this problematic history that we spoke about. And then here um, comes in a very interesting scholar and photographer called Alan Sekula, who I write about in the book, who I think is, for me, the most inspiring artist I've ever encountered in photo and in text. And he was active between the 70s and the early 2000s, where he died quite early from cancer. But his work was always about combining photography with something else, usually with text, sometimes with audio pieces, with diagrams, but always as kind of a syntax in a way that photos cannot just be placed without a specific order. There is a hierarchy and there is a linearity, and I think I try to do that with the book as well. That the photos are always coupled with text. So even though they're not caption, I would say the essays are kind of a prolonged caption of the photographs themselves. Um, and to always provide a counterpoint to the I don't know, seductive qualities of photography, to the beauty in them, in any kind of photographic project by really rooting them in theory, in context, in a very specific argument that the photographer wishes to convey, and not to rely on this kind of photographic way of seeing. Because I do use photography to make an argument. I show places as unmonumental, and I try to relieve some of this power that these places claim by showing them in kind of a clumsy, wonky reality, especially when I describe Jerusalem itself, and there are a few of the photos show the actual city. I show it as kind of a clunky, messy place that is far from the image people have of it. But at the same time, the text also brings you back. You need to read and see and understand these two legs of the same body. The what Martha Rosler calls inadequate descriptive systems. Neither text nor image can really describe reality, but maybe when we put them together, something can come from that.
It's a challenging one, isn't it? Because of course we've become extremely visualized
Yeah.
in the recent decades through social media, where images are presented as sufficient and captioning maybe a hashtag here or there, but basically irrelevant.
Yeah.
That's a strong position to take then. It's a political position to take, isn't it? It's a sort
Hmm.
of a call to arms or a call to observation, or in a way, the photographs you present seem to be pursuing authenticity as a kind of central principle. Would you say that's fair? Are they trying to be authentic? And
Hmm.
whose authenticity is it? Is it you, as you say, as the secular anthropologist? Is it authentic to the lived experience of everyday people in Jerusalem, or to the touristic pilgrimage goer?
I think that authenticity is a difficult concept, and in a way, it counters the logic of analogy. It counters the magic of analogy, let's say, because for centuries, Jerusalem was anywhere and everywhere at once. Jerusalem was inside oneself.
Hmm.
Jerusalem was in your own backyard. Jerusalem was somewhere far away that you knew it's there, and that is all that mattered. There were many truths. There was many subjective memories, and they could all happen at the same time, and they didn't necessarily overlap or were at odds with each other. But then once this idea of authenticity came up, that's when this mythical idea kind of broke down. And I think photography had a part of that. I think the thought that photography is authentic is problematic because it breaks down the possibility of many, many truths. And archaeology was also a part of that. So I think around, like I said before, once archaeology and authenticity and photography became a thing, they wanted to say this is the one real place. There's only one Jerusalem, and it's here. It's right here beneath all these layers of past profane civilizations that came here after us. And these should all be removed because we want to find the authentic place.
Mhm.
And I think analogy is something else. I don't think, I mean, analogical thinking is not innocent in any way. It's also part of different cycles of exploitations of people of faith. So building a Jerusalem in Bologna, the church of Santo Stefano, to provide local people with their own orientation, their own spiritual kind of place, focal point helped a lot the city during the Great Fire of Bologna at the end of the 10th century was completely revived after building the Church of Santo Stefano. It created like a Bilbao effect that brought people from all over the region to Bologna. Really, really like a branding thing, like a capital of culture, having a Jerusalem there. So analogical thinking and analogical architecture is not innocent. It's never just about providing people with a place to contemplate their inner truth and their own salvation. No, there's always an economic or political gain to be made by those wishing to do it. They will always find a way. So it doesn't resolve the conflict, but I think it does offer something radical, which is kind of the possibility to reduce or to alter the attachment, not just attachment of meaning, meaning to place doesn't have to come from meaning from connection to land. Maybe there's a different ethics of attachment. Maybe it's about proximity and not about ownership. Maybe it's about exclusion and not sorry, it's about care and not about exclusion, not about enclosures. Um, I think collective memory is a big term here, and it's something that is really being weaponized, especially in this region. So I think analogy does give us a different path. It doesn't solve it, but it gives us possibilities. That your question of authenticity, I think that's where this thinking kind of begins. How do you counter authenticity and the singularity of authenticity with the possibility of analogy, of proximity, of inclusion?
Can you give an example? One of the case studies from your book, I thought, well, perhaps in chapter two, more Jerusalem than Jerusalem itself, the case
Mhm.
of Varallo. Can you sort of explain how this analogy is played out in this case, in a very kind of literal way or direct way?
Mhm. Varallo is a hilltop in the northern Italy, kind of at the foothills of the Alps, the southern side of the Alps. And there was a monk there, a Franciscan monk, that came back from Jerusalem itself and wanted to kind of create a Varallo for people. I mean, a Jerusalem for people that could not go all the way there. And I think it's a very interesting case because he found a hilltop. Which he thought was kind of analogically topographical to Jerusalem. So the topography there reminded him of the topography he saw in Jerusalem, or maybe it was just convenient because this was his home. And he built there a series of chapels that he named after places in Jerusalem and in the Holy Land at large, so Palestine, so also Nazareth and Bethlehem. and he invited people to come and worship these places. And I think that the first version of Varala wasn't very successful because it was a bit confusing for people, because they came and they encountered Jerusalem in a geographical way. So, according to the same sequence they would if they would go to Jerusalem itself. And I think this is interesting because here, instead of doing a geographical arrangement of a place, they changed to chronological arrangement. So, according to the chapters of the Bible, this is how they organized space, almost like in a Disneyland way. First, you had the book, and then you had the space, and not the other way around. So, after the Council of Trent, and the whole waves, the waves of Reformation coming from the north of the Alps, and Martin Luther, and this idea that there's just too many things happening, too much knowledge, too much content, too many characters. We really have to make this about a legible, predictable ritual. And so they created the numbered stations, the stations 1 to 42 or 43, I think. This is where this codification of the stations began. And then it was really about the chronology of the Bible and the stations of the cross and the whole story of Christ is a very legible way. And then it really became an incredible place. Then even the Pope said that going to Varala would be as valuable as going to Jerusalem itself. You would get the same benefits in the afterlife. You would get the same indulgences. And people of all classes of society, from ambassadors, everyday people, just from the region, really this popular audience came to Varalo to experience what they couldn't experience in Jerusalem itself. And to be honest, it's probably much better than Jerusalem itself, because at that time, Jerusalem was not even under Christian rule. It had a different ruler, which obliterated most of the Christian places. As we said, Jerusalem has always been under a certain battle for its narrative, which was written through its monuments, through its sites. And going to Jerusalem itself would be a huge disappointment to pilgrims. And that's why having it in a sterile way, in a mountaintop, provides so much more spiritual connection and space for contemplation than Jerusalem itself. I read several diaries of pilgrims who went to Jerusalem then, and they were not even allowed to pray publicly. They weren't allowed to show any emotions. They were sort of locked in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre overnight, and then first thing in the morning they quickly rushed through all the sites before leaving the city. So analogy here gave people the possibility to show a range of emotions and to really meditate in a way that the real place couldn't. And maybe this is a bigger argument about connection, about spiritual connection or spirituality at large. Does it happen more inside or on the outside? Do you need to go to a place to feel something, or can you feel it within you without kind of subjecting your body to different forms of exploitation that happens on the outside? I think it's always this tension between inner ascension and outer ascension, which is also why many of these analogies that you see in the book are built on topographies. They're built on kind of ascending hills, because like in Buddhism, spiritual ascension is always coupled with physical ascension, even if it's just a slight topographic elevation.
It's really super fascinating. It reminded me, a few years ago, co-wrote a paper with Bob Proctor at University of Bath on some pilgrimage sites in Scotland. One particular one, Carfin, which is a grotto to Our Lady of Lourdes. So the famous southern French site of the apparition of Our Lady of Lourdes. And Monsignor Taylor in 1922 opened this grotto in this southern Glasgow suburb in Scotland. And it became enormously popular. enormously popular and was actually instrumental. And I don't know, to go back to your point about the politics of this, or perhaps the socio-political or cultural
Mhm.
agenda, was instrumental in enabling Catholics to have equal rights in Scotland in the
Mhm.
first half of the 20th century. They hadn't been allowed to freely associate in public in number, even though Catholic emancipation had occurred in the 19th century in Britain, in England. So yeah, I do appreciate that, but I guess I'm more interested in this spiritual dimension and this virtual dimension.
Mhm.
I wanted to understand better this idea of this virtuality that's at play,
Mhm.
this idea that this architecture or this spatial formation constitutes an equivalent.
Mhm.
What's the kind of theoretical positioning here?
Mhm. I write in the book about this virtual pilgrimage, which is this phenomena in the Middle Ages and onwards where nuns or female spiritual women that were enclosed as such, they were not allowed to leave the convent, um, still wanted to kind of undertake this spiritual journey. And so they had these meditational guidebooks, which are incredible. They were written by obviously men who really went on the actual journeys to Jerusalem. But when they came back, they rewrote the journey in a way that would be approachable and legible and useful to enclosed women or enclosed people. And they gave very precise instructions about what to do every day. So a nun would go into her cell for 2, 3, 4 months, and there is a great book by a scholar called Catherine Rudy about this. And she describes how they would go into their cell and embark on a several months of pilgrimage. So they would really say goodbye to their fellow nuns, to everyone, and they would not leave the room. And they would go through intense, ecstatic, emotional episodes because they would reach places and see things. But this is all thanks to the book, to the guidebook, and to their own ability to imagine and to meditate, um, because they would see and read and perform with their own bodies what they would otherwise perform on a real pilgrimage. So this is walking, kneeling, crawling, um, and I think the magical thing here is that these books would illustrate a completely different reality of what the actual place was. So you would reach a church that in reality was very dark and small and kind of not very accessible, but in your guidebook it was bright and lit and accessible and full of space for you to meditate and contemplate, and you can transform yourself there, transport yourself in time and space very easily through these meditation guidebooks. And I think also the interesting thing is that while many of the places where things happen were in Jerusalem, the objects, the pieces, the relics were in Rome. The crown of thorns, the different things that were used by Christ. And so, if you would use these books, you could leap between Rome and Jerusalem and visit some of the relics and some of the places in the same journey, in a way, creating a very contemporary um, way of practicing, of collapsing space and time, um, without subjecting yourself. I think during the pandemic, we all felt this, how you would have this virtual travel to many different places. And I think this is essentially what they did. They bypassed the dangers of reality by creating their own version, which was much better than the original. It was a distilled version of what Jerusalem is to them.
Mm. But like you were saying at Varela, this idea that actually by extracting the physical intimidations and discomforts, you are able to spiritually engage even more deeply. You can spend that energy doing the thing you're supposed to be doing, which is reflecting on the journey of Christ or the pilgrimage.
Yeah, precisely. Precisely. I mean, the etymology of pilgrimage is from foreigner, or a stranger. I think it's a stranger walking through a place, is the precise etymology. So, in that sense, it's not about the destination. It's not about where you go. It's not about pursuing a religious objective or a healing objective in the case of ancient Greece. Um, it's about leaving your own attachment, your own structure, leaving home, leaving the family, the daily practice, and entering this liminal stage, as Victor Turner would call it, but really leaving a place and entering a different stage in your life, even for a brief period. So this is what pilgrimage is about, and this why it doesn't matter if you're embarking on a 6 year journey or a 6 minute journey, or if it's outside or in your own home, or how far you go. It's more about deciding to disengage and connect with a greater system that you
Mm.
wish to embark on. And I think also this is why this is also where representation becomes interesting, because when you enter this liminal stage, you become much more susceptible to new sights and sound and tastes, which is why a big part of my methodology was also to read pilgrims' diaries and travelogues throughout all the ages, from the first one of the pilgrim from Bordeaux in the beginning of the fourth century up until today. My PhD was mostly about reading these travelogues because I believe they obviously they're very subjective, but they're also very interesting to tell about a person's state of mind when they're on the road, when they're a pilgrim. And sometimes, going back to this question of authentic, sometimes what they feel and what they see is more important than what was actually there on the ground. Because
Mm.
then they write these diaries, they come back, and more people read them, and it becomes this cycle of expectations, and that maybe brings us back to where we began from, because the question of violence in the region, because I believe that the dark side of analogy, or the what happened with representing Jerusalem in so many ways in the West, ended up at a moment where, when it was finally opened, when it was there in the 19th century, there was a huge disappointment or disenchantment of what the city really is. We see it with Mark Twain's Innocents Abroad, his book, which is essentially a whole kind of trolling of what the place is. Um, it began as, humorous representations, texts, and then the kind of more serious photographic projects, and then different ambassadors and visitors writing their disappointments in text. And then it ended up with the elimination of the complexity of Jerusalem in 1917 and then in 1967. So in 1917, we see when the British came, um, the first thing they do, the governor of Jerusalem, the first thing he does was to say that um, any building not built from stone will be destroyed, and there will be no more construction from anything but stone, because the city is an ancient one and it should be preserved as such. So people living in shacks, people living in things that were not stable, were all destroyed. Um, just for the sake of what is ancient, is beautiful, and is sacred to a Western eye. Um, and then it continued with C.R. Ashby and Patrick Geddes, these kind of famed Scottish town planner. And Ashby was a arts and crafts advocate, a fellow of William Morris. And their projects for Jerusalem were incredibly violent. They had drawings where you would see homes and cacti, so different local flora, completely erased to be replaced by English gardens and domed houses that seemed more ancient to them, even though they were rebuilt. There was even one that Ashby says he makes these drawings, and he said, "This is how it will look when the unsightly obstructions will be removed." which is entire Palestinian neighborhoods. So we have this Disneyfication of Jerusalem, with stone, with parks, um, just so it can fit the image people had in their own heads. Geddes came from Edinburgh, and for him, Jerusalem had to look like Edinburgh Castle, which means a green park surrounding a hilltop fortress. Um, Jerusalem became only a projection. And this became even more exacerbated after 67. And a recent paper that I wrote that will be published in early 2026 by Columbia University speaks about this project from the 60s and how Israel essentially wanted to turn the landscape of Jerusalem into a Jewish landscape, to make sure to kind of justify occupation from below, from the landscape. Something I would call to naturalize the occupation by
Mm.
planting specific species and organizing them in a way that would look natural. And this is all rooted in imagination of a place and how
Mhm.
contested a place is. And it's incredible because if you think about it, Jerusalem is really a city with no natural resources, doesn't have a big river, it's not a big mountain. Um, it has no strategic importance in the Middle East, um, in the most objective sense. It only has one spring of water, that's it. And yet, the memories, the myths, the stories attached to it, like Edward Said says, completely obstructs the reality of the city and leads to this endless cycles of violence that in my work I try to highlight, first of all, to show, to explore with architectural and landscape tools, using photography, how this happens, and then to think about the possibility of analogy as a different ethics of attachment to a place.
There's lots I want to ask about this idea post 67 of the purification of the imaginary, and that this political process that's currently underway is transparently a process of purification with all of the horrific baggage that that word can, not necessarily, but can and has embodied, particularly for the Jewish people, which is an interesting and traumatizing paradox in many ways. But I think we're low on time, and I don't want to hold you away from your minus 17 Celsius weather too much longer. But I wanted to understand, what can we take forward from this idea of the liberation from territoriality that
Mhm.
this analogous Jerusalem, this virtual pilgrimage to the holiest of holies, can do for us now?
Mhm.
Does it offer any?
Yeah, definitely. I think that what I've mentioned before, we need to remember that analogical thinking is not innocent,
Mm,
but it does offer us new possibilities of connection and
mm,
attachment. And I do think Judaism has a lot to learn in that sense because it's a
mm,
very blood and territory based religion. So in Christianity, which was very enabling, anyone could become a Christian. Whereas in Judaism, it was not the case. And this attachment to territory has only caused endless amount of blood spill and violence. So I do think that if we can understand that connection to a place should be rethought and understood. And, if you distill why a place matters to you, you will see that it's not about the geography or the territory. It's about things that happen there and how you reenact or remember or recollect what happened there. And this can happen anywhere. This is something that is in our control if we able to learn from the nuns of the Middle Ages how to use imagination to relocate or translate these memories. And only then we can finally divorce sanctity from space, and maybe from politics too, because this only serves institutions of power. In the end, in Israel and in Palestine, you have people that want to live under the same sun, but political bodies, violent, criminal, and evil, on both sides are trying to exploit these sentiments for more power. And people are get caught in the crossfire. And if we find a different way to attach to a place or different imaginaries, different ways to recollect our collective memories, to remember them, perhaps we could detach ourselves from these oppressive structures somehow. I mean, it's a wishful thinking at the end of 2025. Um, but we should find hope somewhere for the dismantling of big oppressive colonial states and hopefully for a brighter future.
Amen to that. It's a beautiful place and a troubling place to stop on, Gili, but I'm extremely grateful. I could listen to you talk about this for a long time. So thank you so very much.
Thank you.
In Jerusalem, and I mean within the ancient walls, I walk from one epoch to another without a memory to guide me. The prophets over there are sharing the history of the holy, ascending to heaven and returning less discouraged and melancholy because love and peace are holy and are coming to town. That's a bit of In Jerusalem by Mahmoud Darwish from around 2005. It's majestic. Thank you to Gili for the wonderful discussion and for checking it over for misspeaks too, even whilst on holiday. Thanks to Chiara at Humboldt Books for enabling this. See the podcast description for links to the book and to Gili at work and on the socials. Merry Christmas, and thanks for listening.